Have you ever been in an argument with someone who's completely wrong, but absolutely certain they're right? They have no expertise, no evidence, no logical argument, but they're more confident than you've ever been about anything in your life. And you're standing there thinking, how can someone so ignorant be so sure of themselves? You've probably heard people talk about the Dunning-Kruger effect, the idea that stupid people don't know they're stupid. That incompetence prevents people from recognizing their own incompetence. But what most people don't know is this. Arthur Schopenhauer figured this out 200 years before Dunning and Kruger ever proved it scientifically. He watched it happen everywhere in universities, in social circles, in positions of power. He saw mediocre minds speak with absolute authority, saw ignorant people dismiss genius, saw fools so confident in their stupidity they couldn't even perceive how wrong they were. And he documented exactly why this happens. The psychological mechanism that makes idiots think they're intelligent. Not just that they do it, but why they can't help doing it. Here's what Schopenhauer discovered. The less people know, the more confident they become. Intelligence creates doubt, stupidity creates certainty. And this isn't random. It's a predictable pattern built into how the human mind works. Today, I'm going to show you the exact psychological process that makes idiots think they're geniuses. Not to mock them, but so you can recognize this pattern in others. And more importantly, catch it in yourself. Because here's what's terrifying. Every person who's ever been confidently wrong believed they were right. Including you, including me. The Dunning-Kruger effect doesn't just apply to other people. It applies to all of us in domains where we lack knowledge but don't realize it. The question is, do you have the self-awareness to recognize when you're operating from ignorance disguised as certainty? This is Schopenhauer explanation for why the dumbest people are often the most confident, why true intelligence always comes with doubt, and why once you understand this mechanism, you'll never be confused by confident idiots again. Here's the core mechanism Schopenhauer identified. Intelligence requires the ability to perceive complexity, but perception of complexity requires knowledge, which means if you're too ignorant to see complexity, everything looks simple, and if everything looks simple, you feel certain. This is what he called the fool's paradise, a state of blissful confidence created by complete ignorance of how much you don't know. Think about learning any skill. When you're a complete beginner, you think this doesn't look that hard. You watch an expert and assume you could do it. Then you try and you're terrible and you realize, oh, there's way more to this than I thought. That moment of realization, that's the beginning of confidence because now you can see the gap between where you are and where you need to be. But idiots never have that moment. They never progress far enough to see the complexity, so they remain in the state of this looks easy forever. Schopenhauer observed this constantly among his peers. Philosophers who'd never studied deeply would confidently dismiss entire schools of thought, not because they'd examined and found them wanting, but because they couldn't perceive the depth they were dismissing. To them, philosophy was just opinions about life. Simple, they couldn't see the logical structures, the epistemological frameworks, the centuries of refined argument, so they felt qualified to have strong opinions with minimal knowledge. The modern version of this is everywhere. Someone reads a headline about economics. Now they're certain they understand monetary policy. Someone watches a documentary about history. Now they can definitively explain why civilizations collapsed. Someone listens to a podcast about psychology. Now they can diagnose everyone. Around them, they've acquired surface-level information, but they can't perceive the depths they're missing. So surface level feels complete. Schopenhauer wrote, "The person who writes for fools is always sure of a large audience." Why? Because fools can't tell the difference between shallow and deep. To them, a complex argument and a simple assertion look the same. So they'll choose a simple one. It's easier to understand. And they mistake ease of understanding for truth. Naval Ravi can updated this perfectly. The more you know, the more you realize you don't know. But flip it, the less you know, the less you realize you don't know. And when you can't see what you're missing, you feel complete. Here's the test. Ask someone about a complex topic. Economics, politics, philosophy, science. If they give you a confident, simple answer with zero caveats, they're operating from ignorance, because anyone who actually understands complexity knows nothing worth understanding is simple, and anyone who actually knows deeply speaks with qualifiers. It depends on in this context generally, but there are exceptions. Certainty is the language of ignorance. Nuance is the language of understanding. Here's a pattern you've definitely noticed. Someone has surface-level exposure to a topic. read a few articles, watch some videos, heard some discussions, and now they speak about it with the confidence of someone who studied it for years. They don't realize that familiarity and expertise are completely different things. Schopenhauer called this the illusion of comprehension, mistaking recognition for understanding. You've heard the terms, you know the basic concepts. You can follow a conversation about it, so you assume you understand it. But here's the difference. Familiarity means you've been exposed to ideas. Expertise means you can work with those ideas. Apply them, test them, see their limitations. Familiarity is passive, expertise is active, and idiots can't tell the difference. Think about how this plays out. Someone hears about Stoicism, reads a few Marcus Aurelius quotes on Instagram. Now they're giving life advice based on Stoic philosophy. But ask them, what's the Stoic view on preferred indifference? How does Stoicism resolve the problem of external goods? What distinguishes Stoic ethics from Epicurean ethics? Blank stare because they don't actually understand Stoicism. They're familiar with some quotes, but familiarity feels like understanding to them. So they speak with confidence. Schopenhauer experienced this constantly in academia. Colleagues would mention his work in conversations, use his terminology, reference his ideas. He'd think, oh, they've read my work. Then they'd say something that proved they completely misunderstood the fundamental premise. They were familiar with his ideas. They could name drop correctly, but they hadn't understood. They just absorbed surface patterns and they couldn't tell the difference. The modern explosion of this is social media. Everyone's familiar with everything. No one understands anything deeply. You scroll through content on neuroscience, psychology, philosophy, politics, economics, you've heard the terms, seen the debates, absorbed the talking points, and that familiarity creates the illusion. I know about this, but knowing about something is not knowing something. Marcus Aurelius understood this. Everything we hear is an opinion, not a fact. Everything we see is a perspective, not the truth. But idiots hear opinions and think they've acquired facts. They see perspectives and think they've grasped truth because they can't distinguish between exposure and understanding. Here's why this matters. When you mistake familiarity for expertise, you stop learning, because why would you study something you already understand? So you remain at surface level forever while feeling like you're informed. This is why idiots think they're smart. They've confused recognition with comprehension. They've heard about things, so they think they know things, and their confidence grows in proportion to their exposure, completely independent of their understanding. The practice before speaking confidently about something, ask yourself, could I teach this to someone else? Could I defend this against expert counterarguments? Could I apply this in a novel situation? If no, you're familiar, not expert. And familiarity should make you curious, not confident. Intelligent people know the difference. Idiots don't. Here's something Schopenhauer identified that's brutal. To recognize that someone is better than you at something, you need to be somewhat competent yourself. If you're completely incompetent, you can't even perceive excellence. A child watching a chess grandmaster can't appreciate the genius of the moves. They just see pieces being moved. A person with no musical training can't distinguish a virtuoso from a competent player. They both sound good. This is what Schopenhauer called the competence threshold for recognition. You need baseline competence to recognize superior competence, which means if you're truly incompetent, everyone looks roughly the same to you. The expert and the amateur, the genius and the mediocre. You can't tell the difference because you don't have the knowledge to perceive the difference. And this creates a devastating cycle because you can't recognize excellence. You don't know what to aspire to because you don't know what to aspire to. You never improve because you never improve. You remain unable to recognize excellence forever. Schopenhauer saw this among philosophy students. They'd read Kant and read some random blogger's philosophy essay and think both are just opinions about reality. Both are equally valid. They couldn't see that Kant built rigorous logical systems while the blogger just shared unexamined assertions, because seeing that difference requires philosophical training they didn't have. So to them, all philosophy looked the same. The modern equivalent is everywhere. Someone can't tell the difference between a scientific study in a blog post that references science, an expert analysis and a confident opinion, a well-reasoned argument and a well-delivered speech, because they don't have the confidence to see the distinction. So when they produce low-quality work themselves, they genuinely think this is as good as what experts do, because in their perception it is. They're not being arrogant, they're being blind. Their incompetence is so complete they can't see the gap. Naval's insight applies here. Specific knowledge is knowledge that you cannot be trained for. If society can train you, it can train someone else and replace you. But idiots can't see specific knowledge. It's invisible to them. They see what everyone sees. Surface patterns, they miss what experts see. Deep structures and missing it. They assume it doesn't exist. Example, someone writes an essay. It's poorly structured, uses fallacious reasoning, makes unsupported claims, but to them, it looks just like professional essays they've read. They can't see the logical gaps in their argument, the lack of evidentiary support, the weak transitions between ideas, the failure to address counter-arguments, because seeing those requires skill they don't have. So they submit it with confidence, maybe even feel proud, while an expert reading it sees glaring flaws on every page. The gap between their self-assessment and reality is massive, but they can't perceive the gap. That's the whole problem. What this means when idiots think they're smart. It's not delusion, it's blindness. They're genuinely unable to see how far they are from competence, because seeing that distance requires the very competence they lack. Schopenhauer, talent hits a target no one else can hit. Genius hits a target no one else can see. But idiots can't see that there's a target at all. They think showing up is the same as hitting it. But here's where it gets interesting. Some idiots aren't confidently simple. They're confidently complex. They use big words, reference obscure concepts, construct elaborate theories, and because it sounds complicated, they assume they're being intelligent. Schopenhauer called this complexity as substitute for depth, the belief that if something is hard to understand, it must be profound. But as Schopenhauer knew, complexity can hide stupidity as effectively as it can express intelligence. Actually, it's often better camouflage because simple stupidity is obvious, but complicated stupidity that can fool people. Think about academic writing, business jargon, pseudo-intellectual conversations. Someone says the paradigmatic instantiation of post-structural dialectics reveals the inherent contradictions in hegemonic discourse frameworks. Sounds smart, right? But what does it mean? Strip away the jargon, and you get looking closely at modern ideas, shows contradictions in dominant narratives. The complex version sounds more intelligent, but it's not, it's just obscured. Schopenhauer was vicious about this among philosophers. He'd read papers filled with technical terminology, elaborate sentence structures, references to obscure texts, and beneath all that complexity, often nothing, no actual insight, just familiar ideas dressed in complicated language. He wrote, "It is just as much a sickness to keep digesting knowledge in the mind without giving it any discharge in work as it is to eat much and not digest." These people consumed complex ideas, but didn't digest them into understanding. So they just regurgitated complexity, thinking that's what intelligence looks like. The modern version is TED Talks. Someone delivers a presentation filled with neuroscience terminology they barely understand. Frameworks they didn't create, studies they cite, but haven't read buzzwords that sound innovative. And because it's complex and delivered confidently, audiences think this person is brilliant, but ask them to explain the actual mechanism to defend against expert critique, to apply it in novel situations, and the facade collapses because they were performing intelligence through complexity, not demonstrating it through understanding. Marcus Aurelius cut through this. If you can't explain something in simple terms, you don't understand it, but idiots invert this. If I can't explain something in simple terms, it must be really sophisticated. No, it means you don't understand it well enough to simplify. Real intelligence can toggle between complex and simple, depending on audience. Performed intelligence can only do complex because that's where they can hide their lack of understanding. How to spot this? Ask them to explain their complex idea simply. If they can, they understand it. If they can't, and instead, just repeat the complexity in different words, they're performing. Schopenhauer spent years simplifying profound ideas, making difficult philosophy accessible. His contemporaries criticized him. Real philosophy should be difficult to understand, but he knew difficult to understand and deep are not the same thing. Sometimes the deepest truths are simple once you truly understand them, and complexity is often just confusion dressed up as sophistication. Here's the most frustrating trait Schopenhauer identified. You can't correct an idiot, not because they refuse to listen, but because they don't have the framework to process correction. Correction requires you to recognize that you were wrong, which requires you to perceive the gap between your belief and reality. But if you can't perceive that gap, you can't be corrected. You'll just interpret correction as disagreement. Schopenhauer called this the closed loop of ignorance. Ignorance prevents you from seeing evidence. Not seeing evidence reinforces ignorance. You're trapped in a cycle you can't break from the inside. Think about arguing with someone who's confidently wrong. You present evidence, they dismiss it. That's just your opinion, you show. Them data, they question the source. That study is biased, you use logic. They don't follow, you're overcomplicating it. Every tool you use to correct them fails. Not because the tools are bad, but because they don't have the equipment to receive correction. It's like trying to send a fax to someone who doesn't have a fax machine. The message is clear, the transmission method works, but they don't have the receiver. Schopenhauer experienced this constantly in academic debates. He'd present carefully constructed arguments against his opponents. They'd respond with mischaracterizations of his position, straw man fallacies, complete misunderstandings, and when he'd point this out, they couldn't see it because seeing it would require the philosophical training they lacked. So they just doubled down on their misunderstanding with confidence. The modern version is every internet argument ever. Someone makes a claim, you provide counter evidence. They don't engage with the evidence. They just restate their claim. You point out the logical fallacy in their reasoning. They don't understand what a logical fallacy is, so they just get defensive. You're speaking different languages and they can't learn yours because they don't know it exists. Naval's observation. Desire is a contract you make with yourself to be unhappy until you get what you want. Apply this. The desire to be right is a contract idiots make to never learn anything. Because learning requires admitting you were wrong. And admitting you were wrong requires perceiving that you were wrong. And if you can't perceive the gap between your belief and reality, you can never admit wrongness. So you never learn, and you remain confident in your ignorance forever. The mechanism? Imagine someone who believes the Earth is flat. You show them photos from space. They say those are fake. You explain physics. They don't understand physics, so they dismiss it. That's just theory. You point to ships disappearing over the horizon. They have an alternate explanation. Perspective. Every piece of evidence gets reinterpreted through their existing framework, because accepting the evidence would require abandoning the framework. And they can't abandon the framework because it's the only one they have. This is why Schopenhauer said, we forfeit 3/4 of ourselves in order to be like other people. But idiots have forfeited the ability to change. They've locked themselves into their current understanding, and no amount of evidence can reach someone who's locked the door from the inside. What this means, you cannot argue someone out of a position they didn't argue themselves into. If their confidence comes from ignorance, evidence won't fix it because they don't have the framework to process evidence that contradicts their certainty. Schopenhauer knew some people are unreachable, not because they're stubborn, because they're structurally incapable of receiving correction. And spending energy trying to correct them is just frustrating yourself. So here's what Schopenhauer would tell you about why idiots think they're smart. It's not arrogance, it's structural blindness. They don't know what they don't know. They mistake familiarity for expertise. They can't recognize superior skill. They use complexity as camouflage. They're immune to correction. They surround themselves with agreement. Each mechanism reinforces the others, creating an impenetrable fortress of confident ignorance. And here's what's brutal, they're not lying. They genuinely believe they're intelligent because from inside their fortress, they can't see outside it. The walls are too high. The blindness too complete. Schopenhauer wrote, talent hits a target no one else can hit. Genius hits a target no one else can see. But idiots can't even see that targets exist. They think existence is just wandering around, and they're doing it perfectly. Now here's the terrifying question. How do you know you're not one of them? Because every idiot believes they're intelligent, including you. When you're being an idiot, so how do you escape the trap? Schopenhauer's answer: doubt. Intelligent people doubt themselves constantly. Not paralyzing doubt, but productive doubt. The kind that asks, am I sure about this? What might I be missing? Who knows more than me? What evidence would change my mind? Idiots never ask these questions because their certainty protects them from doubt. But intelligent people live in doubt because doubt is the only antidote to comfortable ignorance. Naval, the modern devil is cheap dopamine. The modern angel is free education. But add, the modern idiot is someone who chooses dopamine over education while calling it wisdom. Here's my challenge. Pick one thing you're confident about. Really confident. Now, spend this week actively looking for the strongest arguments against your position. Not to find flaws to dismiss, but to genuinely test whether your confidence is justified. If you can't find good counter-arguments, you're not looking hard enough. And if you find them but can't engage with them honestly, you're being an idiot about this topic. And that's okay, we all are about something. The question is whether you have the humility to recognize it. If this made you uncomfortable, if you felt defensive reading this, good, that discomfort is your intelligence fighting against your ego's desire for certainty. Listen to it right in the comments. I'm choosing doubt not as weakness, as wisdom. Because Schopenhauer knew the wisest person is the one who knows how much they don't know. And the biggest idiot is the one who can't perceive the depths of their ignorance. Choose wisely. Machiavelli was a 16th century frontline political thinker with powerful advice for nice people who don't get very far. His thought pivots around a central, uncomfortable observation that the wicked tend to win, and they do so because they have a huge advantage over the good. They are willing to act with the darkest ingenuity and cunning to further their cause. They are not held back by those rigid opponents of change, principles. They will be prepared to outright lie, twist facts, threaten, get violent. They will also, when the situation demands it, know how to seductively deceive, use charm and honeyed words, bedazzle and distract. And in this way, they conquer the world. It's routinely assumed that a large part of what it means to be a good person is that one acts well. One doesn't only have good ends, one is committed to good means. So if one wants a more serious world, one needs to win people over through serious argument. Not clickbait. If one wants a fairer world, one has to judiciously and gently try to persuade the agents of injustice to surrender willingly, not through intimidation. And if one wants people to be kind, one must show kindness to one's enemies, not ruthlessness. It sounds splendid, but Machiavelli couldn't overlook an incontrovertible problem. It doesn't work. As he looked back over the history of Florence and the Italian states more generally, he observed that nice princes, statesmen, and merchants always come unstuck. That's why he wrote the book for which we know him today, The Prince, a short, dazzling manual of advice for well-disposed princes on how not to finish last. And the answer, in short, is to be as nice as one wished, but never to be overly devoted to acting nicely, and indeed to know how to borrow, when need be, every single trick employed by the most cynical, dastardly, unscrupulous, and nastiest people who have ever lived. Machiavelli knew where our counterproductive obsession with acting nicely originated. The West was brought up on the Christian story of Jesus of Nazareth, the very nice man from Galilee who always treated people well, and wounded up as the King of Kings and the ruler of eternity. But Machiavelli pointed out one inconvenient detail to this sentimental tale of the triumph of goodness through meekness. He is always watching, always learning, always guarding the citadel. The door to the cage is open. You have walked out. Don't walk back in just because you miss the company. Keep walking into the dark, into the deep. That is where the treasure is. If this opened your eyes, understand this is only what I can show publicly. There are videos I cannot upload for everyone. There are aspects of dark psychology that I simply cannot discuss publicly on YouTube without being censored or demonetized. The algorithm suppresses the most powerful information. Those exist behind the join button. If you're still here, you're not like the others. Subscribe if you haven't, but if you want what's hidden, click the join button and step into the architect level. You will unlock exclusive uncensored videos that dive into the deepest parts of the human psyche. Most won't, that's the point. Connect with new update, comment below your thoughts.